Yum, yum!
Greg here from Pixel Fondue, and this is another video about the texture switch node. In the first one, if you haven't seen it yet, you should probably watch it first because I go through things a lot slower, and I'm going to go through things a little bit faster in this video. But the texture switch node lets you apply images to a whole bunch of different meshes or polygons all in one go, and you can sort those images very specifically using the particle ID channel value on meshes. So each mesh has a particle ID channel value. And you can use this, where is it? Right there. You can use that to determine which images go to which meshes, which is what the first video is about. There's a lot of, it's very powerful and very efficient way to texture. But sometimes you just want to randomly throw textures all over a bunch of mesh items or instances. In this case, I've got a ground item and a bunch of trees. Some are just meshes, some are instances. Instances, that's a sucky word to say. And sometimes you want to throw images across different polygon islands in the same mesh, and I'll show that as well. That's actually a really powerful technique. So let's just jump right in. I already have this, I already have a material on the trees here, obviously the blue guy in the ground, and I have a UV map on those cards. They're just, a barycentric UV. And so I'm going to put trees randomly on these cards, and there's two different ways to do it. First way I'm going to do it, I will go to the schematic editor, and I'm going to add a constant layer there to the ground. No, not the ground. I'm sorry, the trees. Drag it in there. So we have it on the trees. I like to use a constant layer instead of rigging directly to the material color channel. I like to add a constant layer on top and just rig into that. Gives me a little more flexibility. I can turn it on and off. I can adjust the opacity. I can layer it or switch it around. It's just a little bit nicer to work with. So I always do that first. Add a constant, and then I'm going to add a texture switch node. Again, watch the first video first if you haven't already seen it. That will help a little bit. But here's the texture switch node. Out color to in color. There we go. Still all black because I haven't added my images yet. So before I add images, I need to add image map textures. So there's my image map shader, image map texture node, right? These little green ones here, those are actually from Octane. Don't worry about those. If you don't have Octane, no worries. But there's my texture layer, texture node. It shows up in the node folder in the shader tree. It's not being evaluated right now. And I can right-click and duplicate that a couple times. Or if you've got the Zen plugin from Adam O'Hearn, like I have, Mechanical or Zen plugin, you just Control-D, worth the price alone, because that's the way MODO should work in the first place. This little yellow guy here is a texture locator. I'm not going to expand that because it's just going to mess up our view. But I have all three selected, and if I go over here to the texture locator tab, I can set them all to UV map at once and select that UV map texture. And of course, the constant, let's just set that to UV as well. So our texture switch node is plugged into the constant layer. We've got images, everything's set up for UV. So let's add some images into these slots here. I've got a few images already loaded up into MODO, these tree images here, which I downloaded from the internets. And I'm just going to pick them over here. I've got a pine tree, and I've got another pine tree, and I have a palm tree. All right. Then I'm going to select all these at once, hold shift, and I can put all purple guys in at once here. And remember, it's evaluated from the bottom up. So right now, we don't really have anything set up in the texture switch nodes, which is grabbing this first image here, this palm tree, and throwing it on everything. That's looking pretty good. All right, almost there. We got palm trees and everything. We just got to make this random, right? So the easiest way to do that, we go to the texture switch node, and there's something called surface ID value. And, whoops, surface ID value. And you'll see that's changed it up pretty randomly right there. Now we've got a palm tree, a couple of the big pine trees, a little pine tree. Looks all right. That's kind of what we're after, right? Just a quick closer look. I think I did this in the last video, but we're just going to show it again real quick. This is using the shader ID value. You can actually take a look at that over here if you look at under sample parameters, surface ID. Did I say shader ID? I meant surface ID. Hit play. So you can see how this works. We've got this sort of dark rectangle here. This polygon is dark. It's this dark one's getting the palm tree. These sort of really light ones, or light reds, are getting this pine tree, and sort of medium reds are getting this one. So, the surface ID is just a value that MODO is essentially automatically assigning to these different items here, and we're able to use that to drive the texture switch values. You're able to use these surface ID values to drive which meshes and instances get which image. Okay, so that's random texturing using the texture switch node right there. That's a simple way to do it. There's another way to do it. I'm going to actually turn my texture switch back to input value. Okay, so that's going to put everything back to the palm tree here. Keep in mind the particle ID, if I go over to particle ID, if you haven't watched the first video, particle ID is going to use the particle ID of the mesh. So right now, all of these meshes have a particle ID by default of 0. There's the particle ID, 0. But if I say make this tree right here, which is this tree right here, if I want that to be one of the pine trees, I can bump that up to, let's say, 1. And you'll see that it's got that pine tree now. It's getting the top slot, which is this pine tree big. So that's how particle ID works. The really in-depth video on that, if you haven't watched it, on the first texture switch video. This one we're going to do something kind of weird. And the first thing I'm going to do is, in my trees, I'm going to add under processing, a variation texture. Right now that's going to override the constant that's underneath it. In fact, I'll just turn that off for now. Variation texture is interesting, right? It's variation source defaults to particle. This is something that's used primarily to add multiple colors or reflection values or transparencies or whatever to something that's a mesh that's been assigned to a replicator. So a replicator is a bunch of particles and it puts a mesh or a number of meshes at each particle, and the ID of that particle can drive what color it gets. But we're going to do something a little bit different. There's more options here for variation source, and one of them is item. So if I go to item and I give some different textures here, let's say some reds or some greens and some pinks or some cyan or whatever, you can see what's happening, right? So each of these mesh IDs, these item IDs, essentially the same IDs as the surface values I just showed earlier, surface ID values, is picking up a color here. So we can actually use this to our advantage when we're with the texture switch node and the power of the schematic. So let's grab this guy here, and I'm actually going to, let's go back to the gradient editor. I'm going to clear out all these guys. Why not? Don't need them, right? Make that white just for fun. Don't need to do that, but I just did it anyway. I'm going to turn it off, turn the texture, the constant back node on. So now we're evaluating this. I'm going to drag this down to the nodes folder. I'm actually going to make sure the eyeball is on because that's going to make sure that it's evaluated. If I have it off, it'll never be evaluated, even if it's in the nodes folder. So keep that eyeball on, drag it over to our schematic. Now we're going to do a couple of things here. I'm going to take this, and with item as variation source, I'm going to send this out value, texture value out, not the top one here, the computed one down at the bottom. No, that's confusing. I just wish they would get rid of these here and get rid of these here. But they haven't. So bottom value into input value, right? This guy is set to input value. All right. Now we jumped up to the pine tree. We jumped up to this top one. That's okay. We're going to change it. Let's take a look at the edit gradient and the value curve here. So right now it's just linear 1 right across the top, right? So what we want to do is make this just a linear gradient from 0 to 1. So 0% to 100%. And make it linear. Linear. You'll see what happened. We went random now. So what's happening is, let's look at this graph. This graph is set to variation source item. So this graph is a graph of the item variation source. So essentially the surface ID from 0 to 1. You see, if you look at this, it's the exact same as the surface ID input on the texture switch. I know it's a little confusing here. We're using input value, and for the input value, we're using this variation texture node with this 0 to 1 value set to item. So 0 to 100, and each of these items here is on this graph here from 0 to 100. And what the texture switch node does is it gives each one of those guys along the graph, it gives it one of these textures. So 0 to 30.33 gets this one, 0.33 to 0.66 gets this one, and 0.66 to 1 gets this one. It's really the same thing as a service ID. If I change this to service ID, you'll notice nothing changed, right? So it's another way to do it. And one of the things you can do with this that's really powerful is we have some more options in here. And one of them is mesh part. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Right now I have all these different items, right? So what if I change these 3 instances, right click, instances, and change type to mesh. So now those are not instances, they're meshes. And I'm going to grab all the meshes and right click, and my favorite thing to do with meshes is merge meshes. So whoops, hit OK. Now they're all one mesh. You'll see they've all gone back to the palm tree because there's just one item now, right? Well, let's change this guy to variation, this variation texture here that's plugged into our input value. Make sure this guy is set to input value. Let's, whoops, that is on input value. Correct, it is. Okay, so let's change this from item to mesh part. Now we're back to random images again. And this is actually a really powerful thing because this is just using essentially polygon islands. You're giving a different image randomly to every polygon island. And there's all kinds of great uses for that. And one of the things is just this, trees. It's more efficient to have one mesh item with 6 polygons than it is to have 6 mesh items, each with their own transforms and everything else that goes with that. You know, UV maps, vertex maps, everything else. So it's a much more efficient way to texture. We should be able to adjust, take this variation texture and our value gradient. I should be able to make some adjustments in this value gradient. It should change up how these are textured, I think. Let's see if I go right on this, I should get more palm trees. And I do, I got more palm trees. Why do I have more palm trees? Because palm trees are down to the bottom. And by going right, I just gave more spaces. You know, most of this graph is zero now, right? Or the first third of this graph is 0, so about a third of these guys. In fact, if I change this to 30, I might lose one of them, yeah. A third of them get, you know, from 0 to 0.33. Point is, you can manipulate things a little bit if I want some of the main pine trees here. If you have some flexibility by adjusting, by adjusting this graph, how these guys are textured, or which images get assigned to which polygon meshes. So we can change it around a little bit, whatever. But you see how that works. Delete that. So that's really useful. In fact, I actually used this in a project recently. Go over here. This is a, we don't need this guy anymore right here. And unpause that. So pause it back up. This is just a Maya mash animation brought in via Alembic. So this file right here, these mash planes, it's an Alembic file. Plays back in real time. Alembic is great, so you can do animations in mash and reference these, bring them into MODO, and play them back real time. And you can very easily, since this is, again, it's just one mesh with different polygon islands, we can assign different images randomly to each polygon island using that technique I just showed. So let me just spread this back out. Go over here to the schematic, and I've got my planes here. So again, I'm just going to add a constant as review. Let's hear it out loud. What do we add? We add a constant, Greg. Good job, people. Got a constant. Now we add a what? Texture switch node. All right, texture switch node. Good job. Texture switch node. Out color to in color. Looking good. Let's bring some images in here. Add clip. Okay, I've got a bunch of images. So I need some image nodes down here. So image. Now what I'd really like this texture switch node to do is work with the there's a particular type of node in MODO called a, well, there's a couple. There's an image folder, and there's a couple nodes that basically should automate this. We shouldn't have to add like a whole bunch of image layers here. We should be able to just add one of those like image folder layers, put all these guys in a folder, and pump them into the texture switch node. That's a good feature request, so we don't have to do this kind of thing. But let's do like 4 different ones here. Sounds good. Grab all those, right mouse drag, grab my constant, change everything at once to UVs, because Alembic brings over UV maps, because Alembic is pretty cool. All right, right click, shift drag all those guys in there. I don't really care what order they're in. You know what? I'm anal enough that I do. There you go. All nice and neat. All right, we got to put images in all these, so let's just grab a couple things randomly. Boom, 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 and boom. Okay, now we've got images. We have this set to input value. And let's unpause it here. Now it's all just grabbing the first image, so we're good. That's fine. I'm also going to just, in my plane here, I'm going to add an image map layer. Use the clip browser, grab one of these guys, change it to alpha only. So you see that, but as you may guess, I'm going to actually change the effect from diffuse color to stencil. And I'm actually going to invert it. Boom. Not RGPA, stencil, special effects, stencil. There we go. So we stenciled that off. We look at the alpha mat here. That's what we want, right? Looks good. I'm going to put a background there. Let my environment show. Okay, so that looks pretty awful. Let's actually change this to luminous color instead of diffuse color. It'll show up a little better. Luminous color. Now my material, we'll go change that to black and 0, and we'll make this luminous amount 1. Boom. Okay, that looks a little better, right? All right, so what was I doing? Oh yeah, we want right now we're just getting one of these per polygon island. We want random. So again, we're gonna add our variation texture. Got that dude right here. Let's set this to mesh part, edit the gradient, make our linear value graph 0 to 100. Select these both. Linear, linear, looking good. Okay. Zoom in a little so we can see. You can see, I can see fine. Value to input value. And change, whoops. You son of a bitch. Value to input value. Very good. And that should do it. Just make sure this is set to input value. It is. And these are not different enough that you can tell. Let me push my camera in. Okay, now you can tell they're different, right? We have a product manager here, an R&D guy here. Gee, Greg, is this from some boring corporate video? Is that where you got these images? Yes, Greg, it is. Okay, so engineering. So you see that they're all randomly placed now. This is like a powerful way to texture, right? So using the texture switch node and the variation texture node set to mesh part with that gradient there, that linear gradient, and this pumped into input value. Make sure this is set to input value. We're able to put different images randomly to whatever polygon islands we want. Pretty cool. Pretty cool, I think. Getting back to our tree scene, I realized I never put a stencil map on these. There's a couple issues here. I don't know if they're bugs, but I can't. First of all, the alpha channel from these 3 ping images, and they're just the pings with the transparent background, is not flowing through the texture switch node. So I wish it was as easy as coming over here and saying adding another constant and setting this to, say, stencil, and then dragging it over here and simply taking the alpha into the value. That would be great. I mean, you would think that's how it would work, but it does not, unfortunately, work that way. Make sure that's on UV. What we can do, it's a little more of a runaround, but I can Control-D duplicate my texture switch node. And I'm still plugged in here with my variation texture. And I need to duplicate these guys over here. I can Control-D, you can right-click. If you have Zen, if you don't, just right-click, duplicate those guys. Let me set them up over here in the same order. Like so. I believe like that. Yeah, okay. What's on the bottom of this one? Palm is on the bottom. Palm is on the bottom. Okay, got to make sure they're in the same order so they match up. Grab these 3 guys. Put those purple guys in there. All right. Whoops, make sure they're in the exact same order, though. That was not right at all. Okay, there we go. So what I want to do with these is say alpha channel alpha only. And we don't have anything here because our stencil is set to 100% and it's blasting everything out of existence. But then I should be able to take just, say, the red channel and go into value. What's happening here is a couple of things. One, you'll notice that I need to invert it. And 2, it's just getting 1 tree, or something's going wrong here. So there's a couple there's the limitation where I can't just take the alpha and go into the value here. Seems like that should work, but it doesn't. Second issue, stencil doesn't seem to work. If I set this to transparency, transparent amount, now we're looking fairly good, except we need to invert it, right? So one thing we can do, I think if we just select this guy and add color invert, so color invert, there it is. Oh, didn't just throw it in there for us automatically, but I can just grab this red here like that and then output my red into the value, and now my color is inverted and I'm going in as a transparent amount. And I was able to you know, clip out that extra stuff. Now the nice thing about stencil, of course, is if I'm transparent here, if I have any reflectivity, it's going to show up on the entire card, and I have to start accounting for that in the schematic as well. And stencil would take care of that automatically. So stencil would be better, but transparent's fine. That works, even though we had to add another texture switch node in there. We managed anyway, so that's one way to do it. And of course the Polygon Island stuff is pretty cool too. Actually, this is a Polygon Island now as well. So anyway, there you go. There we are with texture switch on randomly placing images on items and Polygon Islands on within the same mesh item. So that's all.
Yum, yum!